Good evening, folks. Welcome to episode 6. And this evening we are talking about marriage and Shakespeare's marriage in particular. Last week we chatted about the natural world and how it influenced the young Shakespeare, and we talked about his passion for the natural world, for animals, plants, birds, and they're everywhere throughout his works. But probably the thing he's most associated with is love. When people think of love poetry, they think of Romeo and Juliet, they think of his sonnets. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? What light from yonder window breaks, and so on. And whether it's about being in love, falling out of love, being tormented by love, he does it. He doesn't hold back. And of course, we've got no documents to explain what he thought of love, what his views were on the subject. A lot has been written about it, about what people think his views were on love, of course. He uses the word love 2,191 times in his works, and that's just love. That's not loved, lovers. But one thing is sure: whether it's heterosexual love, whether it's homosexual love, whether it's love of a ruler for his people, whether it's love for a friend, whether it is a passion for an object, a desire for something, love is made real in his hands. And here's a little bit of an opening from, or not an opening, but it's to open us tonight. It's from The Two Gentlemen of Verona. What light is light, if Sylvia be not seen? What joy is joy, if Sylvia be not by, unless it be to think that she is by, and to feed upon the shadow of perfection? Except I be by Sylvia in the night, there is no music in the nightingale. Unless I look on Sylvia in the day, there is no day for me to look upon. She is my essence, and I leave to be, if I be not by her fair influence fostered, illumined, cherished, kept alive. That's Valentine talking about Sylvia at the beginning, about halfway through of The Two Gentlemen of Verona, one of Shakespeare's very early plays. In fact, some people will say it's his very first play. Stylistically and dramatically, it features. It has features that suggest it's from that very early time in his writing, and his characters are suggestive of early writing. They are young, they're eager for life, they are self-obsessed, they're vibrant, they're a little bit superficial as well in what they love and what they don't love, and it carries with it all the hallmarks of those later comedies. Girls disguised as boys, friends becoming enemies, girls following their heart and going out on a mission and won't have no said to them. And of course, love destroyed at every turn by ruling adults, by parents, or in this instance, the Duke of Milan. And teenage love, which is what that play is about, is something that Shakespeare writes copiously about. It is through almost all the comedies. You could say there are characters, and if they're not the central characters, there are characters in love as teenagers. Obviously think of Romeo and Juliet, but of course you've got Taming of the Shrew, and you've got As You Like It, and All's Well That Ends Well, and The Two Gentlemen of Verona, as we just mentioned, Merchant of Venice, The Merry Wives of Windsor. Although it's about sort of older characters, there is a central young couple love theme as well. And it's this teenage love, because Shakespeare was still a teenager at this point, that we're going to look at tonight. It is 1582. It is summer 1582, and Will is in love. Or maybe he's in lust. We'll find out. A local Stratford historian, a lady called Jean Jones, wrote a book called Family Life in Shakespeare's England, and in it she went through all the records held at the Birthplace Trust in Stratford, and in it she looked through those records of marriages, and between 1570 and 1630, so that's that 60-year period, only out of 106 marriages in that 30-year period, a 60-year period, only 3 marriages were involved men under the age of 20. And one of those three was Will Arman. See, the average age for a man to marry in Elizabethan England was about 24. But Will is 18 when he gets married. 18 and a half, let's be generous. There's not a lot we know about Will's courtship of his bride-to-be, who is Anne Hathaway. We don't know where they met, we don't know how they met, but we do know that Anne gave birth to a daughter on the 26th of May in 1583, the year after they got married, the daughter Susanna, his eldest daughter, which means that Anne must have fell pregnant at some point in August, September 1582. And we know that Will was either married, or they were either married on either the 30th of November or the 1st of December 1582. So that's pretty quick. She falls pregnant. Anne falls pregnant in August, September. They're married at the end of November. Child given birth in the May. So, what's happening? What's going on? Horrid affair. Sounds a bit horrid. Secret marriage. Marriage of convenience. Let's find out. So, as I say, in 1582, Shakespeare is just 18 years old. Most likely he's been working for his father at this point in the wool shop, possibly for 4 or 5 years now. We looked in some of those earlier episodes where John is hitting financial difficulties. Potentially he's not being seen on the council, so Shakespeare's being possibly pulled out of school if he was at school. John's attendance at the last council meeting would be in September 1582. And 4 years later, he'd be expelled from the council. So around about this time, Will is a key breadwinner for the family. He's the eldest of 5 children. And, if he had dreams of an academic career, going to grammar school and maybe on to clerical college in Worcester, then it's not looking great at this point for him. Let's have a little think about Anne, though. Now, if you want to know more about Anne Hathaway, you really should read Germaine Greer's book, Shakespeare's Wife. It is brilliant, and she goes into such fascinating depth about Mrs. Shakespeare, about the woman behind the man, and we always focus on Shakespeare, we don't focus on about Anne. And if you're interested and fascinated about who she is, then I really urge you to grab a copy of Germaine Greer's book. It's really, really fascinating to see not only his life from another point of view, but also to learn about who this remarkable woman was. And I think she really was remarkable. In fact, she's a little bit older than Will at this point. She's 8 years older than Will. She's 26. She's the eldest of 7. And she lived with her father on a 90-acre farm in a place called Shottery. In fact, Hewland Farm was the name in Shottery. And her grandfather, John Hathaway, now he had sat on the Stratford Criminal Court, so a little bit like the Shakespeares, they're a little bit, sort of moving and shaking. And her father, Anne's father, had married twice. The first being to a woman in Temple Grafton, which is Anne's mum. So Anne's mum lived in Temple Grafton. Okay, that's quite important. When he dies a year before they get married. So he dies in September 1581. He leaves Anne in the will her inheritance of 10 marks, that's £6, 14 and 4. A modest dowry, and in fact the same as Mary had from her father, Shakespeare's mum. He was honestly buried, that's an interesting phrase, meaning that he was buried in the eyes of the Protestant faith. But, interestingly, named Catholic, but when he named a Catholic, a recusant, as his executor of the will. So, interesting, again, religious allegiances, coming into Shakespeare's world. Now he suggests. Now at this point, when Anne's father dies, he's living with his second wife. Now Peter Ackroyd, in his biography of of Shakespeare suggests that Anne maybe moved back to Shottery, moved back to Temple Grafton to her mum's house. So remember that again, Temple Grafton. It'll keep cropping up. But there are close ties to Will's family, to the Shakespeares from daily life. So her father, Anne's father, Richard Hathaway, now he'd sold fleeces to John Shakespeare, who in turn, in 1566, so 2 years after Shakespeare was born, in 1566, John, Shakespeare's dad, pays Richard Hathaway's debts, totaling £19. Now remember, the Stratford schoolmaster was paid £20 a year. So, to basically pay the equivalent of someone's wages for a year, John Shakespeare and Richard Hathaway clearly must have known each other fairly well. So it's very possible that Anne and Will may well have crossed paths, over the last sort of 16 years. Remember, in 1666, Will is 2, and which makes Anne, certainly a lot older, 10. So they would have crossed paths at some point. It's interesting that The Old Shepherd in The Winter's Tale, a play written towards the end of Shakespeare's life, and it's got many echoes of Warwickshire, as we talked about, lots of sheep shearing festival, all that sort of stuff. But The Old Shepherd says of Florizel's courting of his supposed daughter, Perdita, he says he loves my daughter. I think so too. For never gaze the moon upon the water, as he'll stand and read, as 'twere my daughter's eyes. And, to be plain, I think there is not half a kiss to choose who loves another best. Maybe it's a bit fanciful to suggest, but I'd like to. There's a kind of romantic idea that maybe, there's a little bit of an echo of Will going and courting Anne in that same way. Who knows? Now, Anne's family home, which is today preserved as the Anne Hathaway's cottage, part of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust houses, is pretty close to how it would have looked in 1582. It would have been, with lots of modifications over the years, but it's on the same site. It would have originally been a single-story building, and 500 years of Hathaway families have lived in that building, dating back to the 1300s. So incredible, really. Now, for Anne, being unmarried at the age of 26 in a rural society was a pretty unusual thing. Also, Anne was unusual, and that to some extent she was free and she was independent. The world was her oyster. As the eldest child, and from a farming background, Anne would have known all how a farm ran. She would have known about butter churning and ale brewing and salting meat and going through the accounts of the farm, being the eldest daughter, remember, again. So it's something that, we also know about her life later in Stratford as the wife of Shakespeare. At New Place, they had their own brewery. She, again, Germaine Greer's book, it's a brilliant account of her later life, running the family estate, if you like. So, it's an interesting thing, actually. Shakespeare's pretty savvy in who he marries, in a sense. She's a really accomplished woman. But what brought them together? Well, we just don't know. There's a lovely, I've mentioned it a couple of times again in the book Ungentle Shakespeare by Catherine Duncan Jones. She paints a really lovely picture of these sort of hot summer evenings in rural life, where it's slowing down at the end of summer before the rush for the harvest, and the cider making and all of that. And in 1582, the harvest actually was one of the best it had been for many, many years, and nearly 12 years. And as we saw a couple of weeks ago, in that same summer, the Stratford Council pays for a mummers' play to be performed that summer. The leader of it is John Davy. John Davy was married to Frances Hathaway, that name, and she's related to Anne's mother. So, you know, you're bringing lots of people into the same orbit of each other. So you've got a young guy here. He's in puberty. Now, puberty for the Elizabethans was a little bit later. Usually occurred about 4 to 5 years later than it does today. So for Shakespeare, he's right in that cusp of a young man, maybe, you know, sexually inquisitive, in the prime of puberty, you know, meets a mature, single, young woman who, with the loss of her family to marriages, all her other siblings are married and they've gone elsewhere, and deaths. She herself is looking perhaps a new life, doesn't want to be living at home in Temple Grafton with her mum all the time. This from the, I can read you a little bit from Two Gentlemen of Verona again. I love this. It's one of my favourite opening lines. The sun begins to gild the western sky, and now it is about the very hour that Sylvia at Friar Patrick's cell should meet me. She will not fail, for lovers break not hours, unless it be to come before their time. So much they spur their expedition. So were these two hot, impetuous young lovers, a virile young guy with, you know, a really able, pretty attractive, we assume, because there's a picture of her that we hope is her, you know, woman. These two really hitting it on, possibly known each other through previous experiences of their families. How they get to know each other, who knows? We just don't know. It's such a tantalizing, exciting thought of what their courtship was like. But, you know, like we were saying a moment ago, Will's fortunes, family's fortunes are on the decline at this point to a certain extent. You know, he's not bringing great prospects in that sense. You know, his dad is no longer the bailiff. He's no longer a guy at the head of the council. You know, Anne either doesn't really bring a financial escape either. So it's not like these two are meeting and getting together for any, you know, sort of societal reasons. So perhaps, you know, we have to think that they complement themselves in other ways. And there's a piece of furniture in Anne Hathaway's cottage. It's called the courting settle. Now it's it's made of elm, and it's about 1 meter. I'll do it on the screen, can I? About 1 meter 30 in length, and it's a settle. It's a little sort of wooden bench, if you like, with a high back, which would have gone near an open fireplace. And the legend is that that's where they sat a courting through the autumn. Sadly, it's all false, because the wood that the settle is made out of dates from the 1700s. And the myth of them sitting on there, you know, Will reading his poetry to Anne, actually supposedly started with one of the last Hathaway descendants, Mary Baker. So have a little Google for the courting settle later. But there is perhaps a little window into their courtship that we can get from his works. And like I say, every week I've said, we have to be so careful about looking at his plays and looking at his sonnets and poems, and trying to find out autobiographical stuff. It's tantalizing to do, and we've had a lot of fun doing it in these episodes, and you can't help yourself. And any artist, of course, puts themselves and their life and their experiences into their work. But there's a sonnet 145, which potentially could be, some scholars think, an early poem that he wrote to his bride-to-be. I'll read it to you. Sonnet 145. Those lips that love's own hand did make breathed forth the sound that said, I hate. To me that languished for her sake. But when she saw my woeful state, straight in her heart did mercy come, chiding that tongue that ever sweet was used in giving gentle doom, and taught it thus anew to greet. I hate, she altered with an end, that followed it as gentle day doth follow night, who like a fiend from heaven to hell is flown away. I hate, from hate away she threw, and saved my life, saying, not you. It was only in 1609 that this particular sonnet found its way into the sonnet, and it's lumped in with those songs towards the end about the dark lady. But it could be Will's first poem. And if you look at those lines, the last two lines in particular, I hate from hate away, she threw, and that's, I hate is in inverted commas as if it's speech marks. I hate from hate away, she threw, and saved my life, saying, not you. Now, many people, scholars will look at that and go, well, hate is het and is the T. I hate from Hathaway, she threw, and Anne saved my life, saying not you. Have a little Google on Sonnet 145. There are so many theories that it could be him. Have a little look. At the beginning of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Aegeus, the father of Hermia, is pretty adamant that, well, more than pretty adamant, that Lysander is not going to marry Hermia. In fact, so much so, he gives Hermia, his daughter, an ultimatum. Either you marry who I want you to marry, or you go to a nunnery, or you'll die. Because Lysander has filched his daughter's heart, he says. Thou, Lysander, thou hast given her rhymes and interchanged love tokens with my child. Thou hast by moonlight at her window sung with feigning voice verses of feigning love and stolen the impression of her fantasy. Wow, I wonder if Will did something similar. Did he give her bracelets of his hair, rings, gauds, conceits, knacks, trifles, nosegays, sweetmeats, which Aegeus calls messengers of strong prevailment in hardened youth? We'll never know what their courting was like. We'll never know if he wrote things. We'll never know if he sang at her window. You'll never know if he turned up there in the middle of the night and climbed up the ivy outside it. Who knows? But nevertheless, the fact remains that Anne was pregnant and she gave birth very quickly after the marriage in May in 1583. So there was a clear need for them to get married. Pregnancy out of wedlock, was not so much, as we're going to find out in a moment, not so much the not so much frowned upon, and the daughter being the woman being ostracized, and so on. Not so much that there was a practical element of being married out of wedlock to it, but also, in fact, the third of all marriages, in fact, in Tudor England, involved the bride being pregnant, and there are records of the Shakespeare's neighbours in Stratford being in the same situation at the time. But it's also about people, and it's about society and this rural, close society that he's growing up in. But unlike today, we get engaged, and the engagement today is kind of the similarity as what would have been back then a troth plighting, where you troth your plight to that person, a hand fasting, where you're committing yourself to that person. And troth plighting was seen as concrete as the wedding vows you're going to give in church. Because at the same time as you troth your plight, you also say that you forsake all friends. And it was only traditionally if the woman had agreed to the troth plighting that a woman could give up her virginity. So the fact that we don't know if Anne and Will plighted their troth and they had a hand fasting together. We don't know that because there's no record of it. But we could perhaps assume that they had, and therefore the marriage, and therefore the wedding, the pregnancy wasn't therefore in too much doubt, very much difficulty. But there is a speediness to it, which we'll come on to in a sec. A hand fasting, by the way, usually also involved the swapping of gifts. So it could be rings, of course, a bent sixpence, or gloves. Now, pretty handy for Will. Lots of gloves were lying around at home. We don't know what they passed to each other. Could have been gloves. Would make sense from Will's point of view. Interestingly, in just as a side bit of info, in 1810, in a field, randomly, a farm labourer, a lady, found a ring, a seal ring, and on it were the letters WS, and they were separated by a love knot. And there's a lot of, it's now in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. You can see it. There's no, interestingly, that you would have used a seal ring in order to seal documents. And on Shakespeare's will, there is no seal. In fact, the word seal is crossed out. So you could infer that Will at some point lost his ring. This is his ring in a field. Was it the ring that was passed to him from Anne or something? Who knows? But it's, again, they're tiny little oases of light on his world for a moment, and then they flicker and they're gone, and we can't necessarily connect them. But it makes things interesting to consider. So a public marriage was needed and was called for. But marriage laws were really strict in Elizabethan England, and you couldn't, and basically there were windows in the calendar to marry. You couldn't marry between the first Sunday in Advent, and Epiphany, so around about the 6th, and what we would say now the 6th of January. Okay, so you couldn't marry in that period. But also you couldn't marry from the 27th of January through to basically Lent. You couldn't get married all of Lent through to April. So you've got this sort of massive, almost sort of 5-month gap where you're not able to get married. And for Shakespeare and Anne at this point, first Sunday in Advent is the 2nd of December, and Epiphany is going to be on the 13th of January. So they can't get married in that window. So at the last minute, it would seem, and it is the last minute, two of Anne's father's friends, this is two chaps called John Richardson and Fulke Sandals. Fulke is sort of Fulke, so Fulke, I'm not sure what the pronunciation would be. Now, we don't know if Will accompanies them. We just don't know that. Now, they go off to Worcester on the 27th of November. And the reason they go to Worcester is to obtain a special marriage license. Now, you might wonder what I'm wearing this evening. This is a Worcester Warriors rugby club top. I am from Worcester. That's my hometown. I'm very proud to be from Worcester, and hence my rugby top, and to play. And Worcester plays its little part in Shakespeare's story at this point. So now the Bishop of Worcester at this time, so Stratford and all of those outlying villages around that, they all sit in the Diocese of Worcester. So the Bishop of Worcester at the time is Bishop Whitgift. Now, Bishop Whitgift grants the license. The license no longer exists. That has disappeared. However, but we do have the note of instruction, and we have the marriage bond, and they're in the archives at Worcester Cathedral. And you can go to Worcester Cathedral, and down the now, if anybody from Worcester's watching or ends up watching this, I think I'm going to get it wrong. It's on if you're facing, looking down the nave, looking towards the altar, it's in the chancel on your right. It's got a name, I can't remember what it is. But that's where it happened. That's where they signed it. That's where they got it. And there are replicas, and there's a little sort of display about it. But they've got the note of instruction, and they've got the marriage bond, but here lies a mystery. The marriage note states Shakespeare's name very clearly, but it refers to Anne as Anne Whatley of Temple Grafton. Temple Grafton, 4 miles from Stratford, where Anne's mother lived. Now, whereas the marriage bond refers to Anne Hathaway of Stratford. So, now, Shottery was in the parish of Stratford, and we know that Will marries Anne Hathaway. So who was Anne Whately, and why is Temple Grafton involved in the marriage at this point? Well, it's been given, I mean, you could create a whole story around this, a movie, whatever, a play, but the very simple and the only explanation that scholars can give and historians can give is a very plausible and simple clerical error made by a very overworked clerk. Because on that same day, there is an Anne Whately. She's mentioned in the parish register from Crowle. Now, Crowle is just outside of Worcester. I used to go there on Sunday evenings with a little boy to the pub. The Crown, I think it's called, in the pub garden, have my panda pop. But Crowle isn't very far away, and the vicar of Crowle was a chap called William Whately, and he basically they had a dispute, a tithe dispute, and so it's very possible that the poor clerk just got Anne Whately and Anne Hathaway mixed up, and that's where the answers for the memory for the mystery possibly lies. Now we also need to add in some mitigating factors here of the narrowing timescale. Remember, because as ever, the factor of religion in Shakespeare's life is very predominant. So let's look at these in turn for a second. Firstly, let's go with time. Now, usually 3 readings of the banns had to be done traditionally on Sundays or holy days leading up to the marriage. Now the window, though, of course, remember, is closing fast. You've got to get there. It's the 2nd of December, which is the start of Advent on this occasion. And we're on to the 27th at this point. And the only available date for a wedding is the 30th of November. So, or the 1st of December. So they've got to get back to Stratford. They've got to go to Worcester, get the marriage license, the special marriage license, and then get back and organise a wedding. Now, thankfully, the registrar had removed the need for 3 readings of the banns. We don't know why. So that saved them a day. And by coincidence, it's an interesting coincidence, the 30th of November is St. Andrew's Day. And St. Andrew is the patron saint of unmarried women. He's also the saint of a local shrine where women went in the hope of falling pregnant. Lots of drama clearly running through Will's life already at this point. Secondly, there's the question of religion that we have to think about as well. You had to be married in one of the couple's 2 parishes. So that was either Stratford or Temple Grafton, which is 4 miles from Stratford. And then Anne was starting to show a bump. Anne was still unmarried at 26. And the man is 7-8 years her junior. And was also son to the former town bailiff, who perhaps is maybe a little bit, trying to keep a low profile. Was it better perhaps to get Anne out of town and married at Temple Grafton as opposed to being married in Stratford? Who knows? The actual marriage certificate of the marriage day itself doesn't exist, so we don't know. There are several candidates for the wedding venue have been offered. Luddington, which is 3 miles from Stratford, where an old resident claims to have seen the parish record, but apparently the curator's housekeeper burnt it when trying to boil a kettle. She needed some fuel for the fire. Back in Worcester, St. Martin's Church is also a candidate, as the records for that year, 1582, have been removed from the parish register. But the most likely venue is going to be Temple Grafton. And the very specific reason for this is that that's where Anne was born. Now, I've just seen Jane there just ask me a question about Bishop Whitgift. Was he the Archbishop? Yes, he was. Well, later became Archbishop Whitgift. But at this point, as Bishop of Worcester, he was well known at the time that he allowed marriages to take place in other locations for reasonable secrecy. And Whitgift, the year after Shakespeare, well, in fact, in 1583, is when he becomes Archbishop Whitgift, and he attends Elizabeth on her deathbed, and it was probably present there, when Shakespeare would have been at court. So again, loads of interest. We may never have met him as Bishop of Worcester. We don't know, but fascinating interconnections in this world. Now, what does reasonable secrecy mean? Well, reasonable secrecy could mean pregnancy to be hidden, a mismatching couple in age, perhaps, or if they wanted a simpler, quieter affair. The vicar in Stratford at this time was a chap called Henry Haycroft. Now, he was really strong in the Protestant faith, whereas in Temple Grafton, there was a chap called Sir John Frith. Now, he is a Catholic from Queen Mary's time, who would later be described in a survey as unsound in religion. He can neither preach nor read well. His chiefest trade is to cure hawks. He turns up in government spy records, and 2 years before marrying Anne Will, so in 1580, he's been reported for conducting ceremonies outside of Protestant laws. Is this the guy who married them? Well, there's a kind of a fun not anecdote, but a fun thought which you were talked about in the rehearsals, when all friars and all religious people in his place seem to be meddling people, sort of do-gooders or interferers. So obviously the friar in Romeo and Juliet, he's also a herbalist and an arranger of secret marriages. The Archbishop of York and Canterbury at the beginning of Henry V, they're secretly plotting to try and get Henry to go back to war against France. The Cardinal Pandolf in King John is very much the voice of Rome, siding with France. And whereas parish priests and small town vicars appear in the comedies, when they appear in the comedies, they sort of present, they're sort of presented in a much simpler form, and usually to perform a wedding of some kind. And even then, they're not the best candidates for the job. You consider Oliver Martex. So Oliver Martex in As You Like It, Touchstone says, I were better to be married of him than of another, for he is not like to marry me well, and not being well married, it will be a good excuse for me hereafter to leave my wife. Whether that is what Will actually thought about his marriage to Anne, again, I'm not making any comment, but the Jacques does respond straight away to Touchstone in the play and says that he should get himself to church and to find a priest who can tell him what marriage really means. And many marriage references, spring up throughout the plays, but they don't really tell us much about his views on weddings and things. Richard of Gloucester in Henry IV, 6th Part 3 says, hasty marriage seldom proveth well. Parolles in all's well, a young man married is a man that's marred. But then Sonnet 116 says, let me not to the marriage of true minds me admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when alteration finds. We hear it so many weddings. And Caesar, in Julius Caesar, reassures his wife Calpurnia that you are my true and honourable wife, as dear to me as are the ruddy drops that visit my sad heart. It's unfair to look too far into the plays, because he's writing for his characters and not for himself. His sonnets were written for his patron and not his wife. So again, you've got to take it all with a pinch of salt, but it's fun to look. Sadly, there's no letters between the two, between Anne and the Will in existence. Unlike Edward Allen, the big tragedian who wrote lots of letters to his little mouse. So sadly, we have no reference of that. After the marriage, our next documented encounter with Will is Tuesday, the 2nd of February, 1585, and that's when he is baptizing his twins, Hamlet and Judith, named after their neighbours. So we don't really know much about their married life, their early married life. Like I say, have a really good look at Germaine Greer's book of Shakespeare's Wife. That talks a lot about the world in Stratford and what Anne would have been doing, and the married life that he leaves behind when he goes to London. It's interesting. Germaine Greer talks about where they would have lived. A lot of people suppose that they just went and lived with the rest of the Shakespeares in Henley Street, but that wasn't necessarily the case for many Elizabethan married couples. The point was you were starting your life together, and part of your dowry, your 10 marks, that dowry that Anne would have had, and the 10 marks that Will would have had to have matched, or John, his father, would have had to have matched, would have been the sum to get you started. So it would have been to buy a plot of land, to build a small shack on. When we think of cottage, again, Germaine Greer talks brilliantly about cottages being this lovely chocolate box idea nowadays, but actually cottages in Elizabethan times were much more sort of shacks. But it would have been their own. Would they have lived with her mother in Temple Grafton? Very unlikely. So we just don't know where they lived to begin with. It is suggesting that there was an independent dwelling at the back of the birthplace, but it would have afforded very little privacy for them. If they were living with Will's mum and dad, then Anne probably would have been engaged in the family business as well, into the gloving, into the housework. We can only assume that the atmosphere was harmonious, if that's the case. Anne and their children do live in the birthplace up until 1597, when they buy new place, the big house, the second largest house in town. So they are living there for a large part of their early married life. It's where they live to begin with. There's no sort of definite answer. But you get the feeling that you get the feeling that it was a harmonious house and a harmonious household. A close family, a loving one. Let me clip ye, let me clip ye in arms as sound as when I wooed, in heart as merry when our nuptial day was done and tapers burned to bedward. That's Coriolanus says that, though he says it to a senator, not to his wife. But Macduff's response to the slaughter of his children by Macbeth, I think, is a really telling. It's a really telling personal human moment, I think. Written much later, obviously, 1606, but it has a genuine, very everyday colloquial feel to it. He says, "All my pretty ones, did you say all? Oh, how kite all? What, all my pretty chickens and their dam at one fell swoop? I cannot but remember where such things were that were most precious to me." I'd like to think that that's Will's own words and voice and thoughts. Anyway, by the 1580s, Will is married. He's got an elder daughter. He's got two twins. Well, he's got a set of twins. He's had a bit of a grammar school education. He's been cosseted by a doting mother, survived the plague. He's a child, no doubt, made to feel special as a survivor of that. He's watched his father go from hero to zero. He's now a husband, a father, and all of that. Possibly the opportunities of apprenticeships or even university careers or whatever may have passed him by. He's also potentially faced with 11 family members in that house in Henley Street. That's where they're living by the time of the twins' birth in 1585. All looking to him as the eldest son to provide. So, what does he do? Well, that question has baffled historians and scholars for 400 years, and that's what we're going to look at next week.